tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
Want to shift gears here yet again. The problem with Friday is that all the stuff we don't get to earlier in the week, we all have to put into one seamless narrative. So we're abandoning the narrative and abandoning the seamlessness, and hopefully it's just interesting enough to keep your attention. But last but certainly not least, Colin Craig is with secondstreet.org, which has commissioned a rather interesting study, a poll through Leger that looks at, I think, something that, if we go back to the earlier discussion we had about abortion in Canada, there's a gap between what ordinary people think and what the media would tell them to think, what the media would sort of claim is the consensus on a particular issue. And one in particular jumps out, and that is about if schools should inform parents when a child shows up and says, I'm actually a woman, or I'm non-binary, or I'm pangender, or the one that I learned many years ago, masculine of center, genderqueer. So a student goes to a teacher and says, I'm this, and these are my pronouns. Should parents be notified? 57% in this poll said yes, but that would be a position that, when it's been mentioned by politicians in other jurisdictions, is like this hateful, bigoted, transphobic position where it's no. I think parents in general should know what's happening between their child and their child's educators. Colin Craig is with me now after that lengthy wind up there. Colin, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Having me, Andrew.
So let's start with the why you've done this question. I mean, Second Street, I know we've had you on, has done a lot on energy policy, on healthcare. This was, when I saw this, I'm like, oh, really? They went there.
Yeah, well, we put our fingers in all the pies. We spend, you're right, we spend a lot of time on healthcare and natural resource issues, but we do some work on education, taxation, lots of different other policies. And we actually did a poll about 2.5 years ago. And one of the questions we asked was, do Canadians think that the public school system has gone in the right direction or wrong direction over the last 20 years? And at the time, about 32% said wrong direction. And we thought, well, that's actually pretty high. That's a pretty significant number of Canadians who don't think the system's going in the right direction. But this time it was 51%. So it's a very, very big jump. And the reason what got us going with this poll is we thought, well, let's ask that question again. And then we sort of were looking at some of the other issues in education. And this was one where, like yourself, and I'm sure lots of your viewers, I had seen these different stories coming up about parents being kept in the dark about, what their children are talking with their teachers about when it comes to pronouns and transitioning, having very serious discussions. And I thought, I wonder if there's any public opinion research on this for Canada. And I hadn't seen any. There were some numbers from the States. So we thought, well, let's ask the question and see what Canadians think.
Well, and the other one that was interesting, not as decisive as reporting back on, gender identification, is this one. 47% of parents agree, or of respondents agree, that schools should have to make materials for topics on gender and race-related topics available ahead of time for parents to view. Now, that one I find interesting, because I think largely a lot of curricular materials are available ahead of time, but I don't think most parents have the initiative to go in and seek those out. Some do, but I was curious kind of what your insights were on that. I mean, is there this realm of materials that parents cannot access and do not know are being taught unless their child tells them?
Short answer is I'm not sure exactly. In the US, there have been some challenges where parents have tried to get access to materials that are being taught in schools and they've had trouble. I'm not sure exactly where that's at in Canada, but I think it's an easy solution that can sometimes help in cases where parents are concerned about what's being taught. For very sensitive topics, we have technologies makes all this stuff so easy now that schools could put this information out ahead of time. So a parent could go in and see, okay, what's my child going to learn about, say, gender-related issues or race-related topics? And just kind of understand, well, do I want my child learning that? Yes or no? And if they have a deep concern, they can say, well, I'd like my child to sit in the library during that lesson or whatever. The other option, of course, and this was, someone else raised this with me, and I think it's a good idea. It also allows parents to know, okay, my child's going to learn this in school today. I want to present a different perspective to them when they get home, so that they can learn a little bit more and, see different viewpoints, have maybe a bit more of a balanced learning exercise when it comes to this topic. So we thought, this would be interesting just to see what Canadians think. And like you say, certainly more Canadians think that's a good idea than people that say not to.
I want to drill down to that one question I led in with about the 57% say yes, the teacher should have to tell, or the school should have to tell parents if a child wants to change their gender or use different pronouns. The regional breakdown I found quite surprising here, because I think if you were to say this, everyone would be like, oh yeah. If I were to ask which province said this yes the most, people would say like, oh yeah, clearly Alberta. And Alberta was actually kind of, it was below the mean there. BC, unsurprisingly, was the lowest, even then at 49%. Alberta, 54% said yes. The real outliers here on the high end were Atlantic Canada and Quebec. Now, Atlantic Canada is a smaller sample, 100 people, so there could be in that a bit of a perhaps a sampling issue, but no. Quebec, 61%. So regionally, I found that just quite interesting.
Yeah, those numbers certainly are interesting. That it is higher in those provinces. Like you say, the samples are smaller, so it could be just partially due to having a smaller sample size.
But it's not just the more conservative the province, the larger the number. Ontario was higher than Saskatchewan and Alberta.
Yeah, and we're not an advocacy organization. We're not taking a position in terms of what governments should and shouldn't do on this. I mean, my own personal opinion is that I think parents should have the right to know. I mean, this is a pretty serious thing for a child to be assuming basically a different identity at school if they're changing their pronouns, but also even chatting with the school system about how do I go about changing my gender and trying to have surgery and all this stuff. My colleague makes a good point. He says schools can't give students a Tylenol without checking with parents first. We're going to let them engage in this pretty serious psychological intervention. I totally understand why parents would want to know. And what I think is interesting is the breakdown between parents that say yes and parents that say no, or rather Canadians that say yes versus no is 57 to 18. And then there's a large number of Canadians who are undecided, I think maybe because they haven't been confronted with this issue, maybe want to know a little bit more, whatever the case is. But it's also interesting, too, that when you shift this discussion from Canadians at large to Canadians with kids, the number increases, goes up to well over 60%, I think 65%.
And not just kids, but kids in the household. So not just like, boomers with adult kids, but parents with kids at home.
Yeah. Thanks for clarifying that. Yeah, it's people with young kids, they want to know. And like I said, I can't blame them. And I think it makes sense because this would be a very difficult thing for a child to be going through if they're suddenly confused about who they are and that you'd want to, as a parent, you'd want to be helping them, right? You'd want to be there to guide them and maybe regardless of what side of the debate you're on with this, I think any parent would want to be there to support their child if they're going through something that's very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm in my 30s. I'm one of the dirty millennials that I complain so often about. And one of the challenges I find is that I think that I was kind of part of this transitional period where parents were engaged in the education system and wanted to do the parent-teacher checkups and read the report cards and learn, but for the most part sort of just trusted that the system was working, just sort of dropped you off at school in the morning and that's that. And I think that parents would be doing a tremendous disservice to themselves and their kids to do that. And all the parents I know, and granted, I mean, there's a bit of a selection bias in terms of who I talk to more often, but they just don't trust it. And the number of people I've heard from that have just self-selected out of the public system who are not the traditional private school or homeschool demographic, but it's largely because of stuff like this.
Yeah, it feels like there's been a lot of controversial news stories in the past while involving public schools. I mean, you're based in Ontario, the Oakville teacher with the extremely large fake prosthetic breasts. I'm sure most of your viewers have seen them. If not, if you Google it, you'll see that these fake breasts were about the size of a Gatorade cooler that an NFL team might throw on its coach after winning the Super Bowl, like absurdly large.
What football games are you watching?
Well, right? You follow the champions, you see these giant coolers being thrown. That's how large these fake breasts are, and many people found them demeaning to women. So you see that kind of thing, and then you see a school system that was just frozen, unable to deal with this, something that I think many people would consider to be extremely inappropriate. On the other side of Canada, in British Columbia, small town Castlegar, BC, an elementary school teacher had a drag queen read to children in the classroom through Zoom. And so many parents were outraged about this. And so regardless of where you stand on these issues, I mean, these are pretty controversial things. And I think more than anything, what we're seeing is a need for more choice. And Alberta has a good solution with charter schools here. For those who aren't familiar, they're basically schools run by nonprofits that are funded by the government, and they tend to specialize in different things. One might specialize in science and math, another one might specialize in a particular like cultural study or language, whatever. Parents have more choice, that they can choose schools outside of the public school system without facing a huge bill, because like I say, the government will fund these schools. So it does give parents more choice. And I think in the rest of the country, we would be wise to be looking at that, because clearly there's a pretty high dissatisfaction rate with the direction the public school system's going in.
Yeah, very well said. People can read the results for themselves over at secondstreet.org. And if you are a parent, at the very least, pay attention to what's happening in your kid's school so you don't get blindsided whenever these stories come up, or an Oakville teacher is waving the stories in your face, so to speak. Colin Craig, always good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks a lot, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.